Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. This is the quantitative video, so basically it's for anyone doing a survey. On the agenda for today is to finish up talking about the descriptive analysis graphic organizer. So that's what's due this Sunday, January 29th, and it helps you organize your thinking to write up your findings. We'll also talk about how to write up the analysis paragraph in your pilot study report, which is not due until February 5th. Thanks so much for your comments and feedback that you've posted to the video. This has really helped me to understand your process and where you are in your process so that I can better meet your needs. I will continue this process. Please post to this video any questions and also just how you're doing in your analysis. And I will reply to this video so people can benefit from that, and I will also email you directly. So in the first part of this video, I'm going to get into how to analyze numerical data. So this is primarily Daryl and Tacey. Carrie, I think you'll probably have numerical data eventually. And Andrea, you may want to watch this just in terms of your first 2 questions in your survey. So first, you've already created your table, right? Or you've downloaded it from SurveyMonkey or Google Docs. You have the people in the rows, you have the items in the columns, all right? I've placed here some videos on how to derive descriptive statistics in Excel from a table like that. These are from a person named Anne Emery, and she does an excellent job of carefully going through each step. Now, some of you may already be really well versed in Excel, and of course you don't have to watch these, but essentially this first video right here shows how to make a pivot table, which is how we essentially make the tables that we then use to create the descriptive statistics. This is kind of this one right here is a Word, it's a processual document. I don't know, it's very strange, but it's kind of cool. And then these 2 are YouTube videos, and you would probably need to watch both of them in order to have these complete pivot tables that we need. And I'm going to give you an example in a second. Some analysis can be done on SurveyMonkey. If you have the more advanced versions, you can actually have it spit out some graphs and things like that, which is fine. One of the things I don't like about it is that you don't have as much control over what you can compare and over what, whether you can use averages and these kinds of things. And also it only does question by question. You can't average questions together. So essentially, after you go through the process, again, you've made your Excel table, then you've watched those videos, you've made a pivot table. This is essentially what it looks like. So this is a pivot table of some of my data. Subject number here, I gave a number I asked respondents to write, to select A, B, C, or D, whether they taught science only, whether they taught at high school or middle school, whether they taught elementary school. So sort of subject, sort of grade level. But I essentially had 4 choices. And right now I'm comparing choice 1, which is science at science at a middle or high school, and choice 3, which was elementary school. Okay, so so number 1 is that I put the subject number in the row, right? You can sort of barely see it, but it's there. Then over here, I wanted to look at the average of several items. So again, this is something Daryl's going to be doing, where they rated how often they use reasoning in the classroom. So there was 4 items. I created an average before I even made the pivot table. And now this is this number right here is the average across all people who taught science, right? And then this one is there are several items that mark traditional instruction. So I had created a column that gave the average. And this number right here is the average across of traditional instruction on a Likert scale of all middle and high school science teachers, right? So so 3 again is elementary teachers. That means that this number is the average across all elementary teachers of how they rate themselves in terms of using reasoning in the classroom. And this is the average across all elementary teachers of how they rate themselves with traditional instruction. Okay, so first things first, one of the things that I wanted to make sure I pointed out, and again, the videos mostly tell you all about how to do this, is that sometimes you have to change what's in, whether it shows an average or a count and these kinds of things. So you can see here, down under values, I put these two things, right? The average of reasoning, or sorry, reasoning and traditional. But it shows them first as a sum or a count or something like that. So I had to actually, one of the ways you can do it is you left click on this button, average of trad, and this box shows up, and then you can select average in the box. Otherwise, it's just going to sum up the number of people who were high school teachers who filled in that survey, and that's not very helpful. So always make sure if you have a construct, you put average. If you're trying to count people, like if we wanted to know the number of people who were high school teachers, you would put count. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but I wanted to show you first. Okay, so don't move forward on these slides until you've made a pivot table out of your data, or else it's just going to start getting a little too confusing. So major points that I just demonstrated in the slide before. Once you've created your pivot table, whether you ask for counts or for averages depends on the question. So binary or categorical questions like gender or ethnicity are usually counts because you're trying to figure out how many people you have of each one. Anything with a scale is usually average. So here's some example. Tacey would ask for some counts of her yes, no, and or maybe questions because there's not that many different ones that you could do. So you might want to know how many people said yes or no or maybe. You may also want to know the percentage of people that said yes, no, or maybe. And there is a way to do that in Excel, but I'm not going to get into that here. There are videos online. Tacey, however, might want to get the average of her Likert scale in years teaching. So that'll download as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 1 being 0 to 2 years, 2 being 3 to 5 years, or whatever it is. So if you ask for an average, you might get 3.5, and then you can go back and interpret that as an average of, 10 to 15 years, right? Daryl is going to have ethnicity in his data, so he would ask for counts or for a percentage of the whole, right? So he would want to know there was like 10 students who were African American, there were 20 students who were Asian, etc. Okay. Andrea has a couple of questions. She might ask for a count of the years that the students were their year in school, right? Or she could ask for their average year in school. So you can actually do either one. So what's the average year in school of these students? The average might be the somewhere in the middle, right? So it depends a lot on what you're trying to find out. If you're trying to find out, are my students evenly distributed? Do I have even amounts of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors? Then you would want counts. If you want to know, okay, generally is my data clumped in the middle, then you would want averages. Okay, so for any scale, like a Likert scale, you would want to use an average. So all of Daryl's construct data, so if he, and Daryl, so we might need to talk about this, but yours are actually not Likert scales. They're answers. They're almost like a test. And that's a little bit of a different way, right? Because each one is 1, 0, whether they got it or they didn't. And then you average across the construct. So we'll probably just have to talk about that. An example of when you would use the average across all respondents for a scale is Tacey's question. How often do you use email in day-to-day routines, right? And then there was A, B, C, D, like 1 to 2 times, 3 or 4 times, etc. Okay. So those are going to translate down. They're going to download as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if you average across all 15 or so respondents, maybe it'll be 4.5, and you'll be like, wow, like, so the average is actually pretty high that they often use email across these 15 respondents. Okay. You can also look at the averages between groups or compare the averages of 2 questions. All right. So if Tacey was interested in, well, I had counselors at regular public high schools and I had counselors at charter high schools, and she may want to compare Well, are counselors at charter high schools more likely to use email than counselors at regular high schools? And so she could use those pivot tables and those averages to say, oh, well, the average at regular high schools is 2.5 and the average at charter schools is 5. That's very interesting. All right. Daryl might want to compare between two financial literacy constructs. Are these respondents more likely to get the answer right when it's having to do with student loans or one of the constructs versus, laws having to do with finances? Probably so, right? So those are some things that you can look at. All right, so back to this example. So you can see here, now that I've created my averages, I have in my rows my two different groups, and I have in my columns actually two different constructs. I can start to compare and think about what's going on here. So in terms of the constructs, we can see that on average, teachers did a lot more traditional instruction, or at least a decent amount more traditional instruction than they did opportunities for reasoning in class, right? Well, this makes sense. This happens a lot. So, but I can actually literally say it here that on average, what they reported, a 3.38 translated to something like once a week, a 4.03 translated to something like nearly every day. Okay. I can also see that science teachers on average reported slightly greater use of reasoning in class than elementary teachers, although the difference is not quite as big, so it doesn't seem quite as important. And that's something to think about. So as you compare different things, different constructs, etc., you may find some that, yeah, there's a difference, but it's really not that big. And so maybe that's not something I would write up in my findings. But there are differences that are pretty big and are worth writing up in your findings. So you can think about that as well. Open-ended questions. Many of you have open-ended questions where anyone will fill out something that they think is going on. But particularly, Andrea, all of your questions are open-ended, so this is very important. So last video, we talked about coding each thing that people said. So this is kind of an example, right? Like these are all things that people said when I asked them this question. When you think of the nature preserve, when I think of the nature preserve, I think of. That was literally the prompt, and then they wrote different things. So in this case, I wrote down each thing kind of like a brief, this wasn't the entire quote, but I wrote down a brief clause of what each person said. And then I categorized them. So here I thought, this one, these are about the beauty of nature and the environment. And then here's things about context, history, and story, which is probably a little bit broad for a category, I have to say, to my former self. So now I have two categories, right? I've got quotes that have to do with beauty, nature, and the environment, and quotes that have to do with context, history, and story. And I have the quotes, which is really great because now I have things to draw on as I write up my findings. The next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit about what this then looks like in the end. But this is, again, sort of thinking about how do I take all these different things people say and categorize them into categories, and then how do I talk about it? So this is essentially how I would write something like that up. So this is, again, in response to this question, when I think of the preserve, I think about, and then I stated, when asked this question, right, students brought up the beauty of the preserve, 3 out of 4. And do you see how I wrote the numbers of students? And this is something, Andrea, with your open-ended questions, you're going to want to do. And then I give an example quote, and this is why we have that graphic organizer. We can draw directly from it. Then I wrote the stories themselves were also an important component to students' changing connection to the preserve. Students did mention physical aspects of the preserve, and then I have a few quotes, birds chirping, beautiful scenery, etc. 6 out of 9, right? I state how many. But they also mentioned the interviews and stories as significant to their connection, 6 out of 9, right? So I'm citing the numbers of students, and I'm giving some examples of things that they said, And I'm talking about the two categories that emerged from this coding of these surveys. So finally, make note of the following. Do some categories seem to matter more than others? In many cases, when you are using open-ended questions, it's often because more people mention it. So that's where it's sort of like, well, 6 out of 9 people talked about this category, only 3 out of 9 people talked about the other one. And also think about, are there some comparisons between constructs or groups that are interesting? So again, like, are some people saying one thing more than others? Like Andrea, in your case, maybe comparing people who participate in the two different campus organizations might be interesting. Do they say one thing more than another? All right, so if making pivot tables and playing in Excel to get those averages is really stretching you, if you haven't done any of that kind of work before, just focus on that. Like really focus on learning how to compare the data and make those averages and get something out of it. However, if you already have a lot of experience with Excel, or if you really love doing this kind of work, there's an optional process of making charts to display your data in Excel. And essentially, I've put a YouTube video here. This is also Ann Kemery on how to make a simple bar chart in Excel. Some of you might do this all the time, and this will be no big deal. For others, it's a really great video to help you make a bar chart. So what I recommend, if you're interested, is going and watching this video. You can use your pivot tables that you're making to make these bar charts. And I recommend making a number of charts as a way of thinking about your data. However, remember that not every chart actually helps you explain anything useful. So you might have a number of charts, but you have to really think through which ones are going to be useful. And the optional graphic organizer that is up in this week's resources is helpful for choosing those charts. I'm not going to talk a lot about the graphic organizer. It's pretty simple. It's about making charts, comparing things within those charts, and then selecting charts to use in your findings. Another just a point is that I find it useful to not make the chart directly out of the pivot table. I usually take the data in the pivot table, copy it, and paste it below as numbers. So it doesn't just copy the pivot table again. And then I make the chart out of that. I find it a little bit less clunky. All right, the next slide just gives you an example of how a chart can help you. This is an example chart that I made using Excel, and you can see exactly the data that I was showing you before, although this is actually a slightly different construct. So this is teachers reporting on their data collection and analysis. I have my elementary teachers, my science only teachers. So again, that 1 and 3. So I'm comparing two people. I'm comparing two groups of people and their average on a particular construct, which is their reporting of how much they do data collection and analysis in their classroom. And so you can see that elementary an average of 2.81, science only an average of 3.33. There's definitely a difference. Whether it's significant or not, we'd have to actually do a statistical test, which we're not covering in this class. But you can see just from the chart that it's pretty different, right? Like you can see it's not, insanely different, but there's enough of a difference here that it shows up. Going back to the first graphic organizer, the one that's due January 29th, you've already done this part, your construct and demographic, your construct, the items, the definition with reference to the literature. That's something we talked about last week. Now, this is what this week covers. After doing these pivot tables and doing charts, if you get that far, you can write up what you see in those charts. So in this case, I wrote up an example. New teachers rate themselves higher on the scale, M equals 4.5, than long-term teachers, M equals 3.5. M is mean or average. This may be because they received training in NGSS in pre-service. Okay, so I wrote up, I compared two constructs, or actually it's one construct. It's one construct, but I'm comparing two groups of people. And because they had a pretty different average, right? And then I'm hypothesizing as to the reason. Now, my survey data cannot actually, most of the time, give me the real reason, but I'm hypothesizing based on the literature. So I should have actually had a citation in there. Here's another analysis. New and long-term teachers all rate themselves fairly in alignment with this construct, teacher prior beliefs. M equals 4.2 for both. That may be because the training was voluntary, right? So again, I give an idea of what I might be seeing, why I might be seeing that. Again, I should have cited the literature, and I give the mean here. So these are the kinds of things you can write up, and of course these are directly transferable to your findings. In terms of the open-ended questions, you saw kind of things that you can write up about those. You would essentially plunk those in here next to each construct. We are now moving on to how to write up the analysis paragraph of your pilot study report, which is not due until February 5th. So first, before writing your analysis section, if you don't already have the following in your methods, add a description, and this is particularly Daryl and Andrea. Add a description of the survey instrument, and add a description of the key constructs and items. So this can literally be the table from the graphic organizer minus the right-hand column, which is the interpretation. So it would give the construct, the items, and the definition. This can be placed directly in your methods. The stuff in the right-hand column would go in your findings. If you are creating your survey from a focus group, all of that information goes in your findings. And Carrie and Tacey, you'll each have slightly different sections where you have this information. Your analysis section then is really all about writing down what you're doing during this time. So as you go through your analysis, just write down a running tally in a few sentences of what you're doing. For those of you who have focus group data, you would write down about transcribing the focus group and what kinds of qualitative analysis you did on the focus group. You might even have 2 paragraphs because you need to talk about that. And then you'll write down your analysis that you did on the survey. For those of you who only have a survey, you'll write a paragraph detailing how you analyze the data, including your goals for analysis and programs and statistics you used. Primarily, at least in this video, we just talked about using Excel and descriptive statistics. Here's an example from one of my papers for really just the statistical analysis part, or the descriptive analysis part that I've been talking about. All survey analysis was conducted in SPSS. For many of you, this might be in Excel. The goal of understanding how teacher instructional practice differed pre to post across grade levels. So here I'm writing down the goal. The survey items were first averaged by construct, right? So really literally writing down, like, here's what I did first. And this is something we talked about in the last video. And I referenced the table where that information can be found. The constructs were then analyzed descriptively to attain a sense of the overall indications of teacher practices and belief in alignment before and after the institute, right? So then I descriptively analyze these constructs to examine these 2 things. And I give my citation. This is that survey book. Key comparisons were made regarding the average differences across subject area and grade level because these were salient in the literature, right? So now again, I'm justifying why I compared different things, and then I have my citation. So this is essentially any kind of analysis of the survey. In terms of doing the analysis of the more open-ended questions, it's going to look a little bit different. It'll probably be more like a meld between a qualitative and a quantitative paragraph.